Hello, and thank you for joining us for this special event, Meeting the Moment, the Urgency and Opportunity to Invest in Water Systems, hosted by the Value of Water campaign. The mission of the Value of Water campaign is to build public and political will for investment in America's water infrastructure and is spearheaded by top leaders across the water industry. My name is Katie Henderson, Senior Program Manager at the U.S. Water Alliance. I'm the staff lead for the Value of Water campaign, and it is my pleasure to open today's events from Stantec's beautiful offices here in Broomfield, Colorado. The Value of Water campaign is a proud member of the United for Infrastructure Steering Committee, and we are pleased to participate in this week of action to champion America's infrastructure. For the past 14 months, the nation and the world have endured an unprecedented public health crisis and an unstable economy. This last year has also highlighted problems with our nation's water systems that existed before but are now impossible to ignore. From the millions of Americans that lack access to adequate water services to the fact that many of our water systems are not built or designed in ways that can withstand a changing climate. These problems are layered on top of decades of chronic underinvestment in our water systems. We know that investing to rehabilitate and upgrade our critical water systems can address not only the acute public health protection needs across the country, but also safeguard the environment, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and provide a path to economic recovery. We have put together a program today highlighting voices from labor, infrastructure policy, and the water sector to talk about why closing the water infrastructure gap should be a national priority and why we can't afford to wait any longer. This is a three-part event, and after the first discussion about the size and scope of our water infrastructure challenges, we'll hear from utility and labor leaders about the public health, environmental, and economic benefits from investing in water infrastructure. Then representatives from the Biden administration will join us to talk about the $111 billion proposed in the American Jobs Plan, specifically for water infrastructure and lead removal, and what this all could mean for job creation and the communities that water providers serve. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott Berry, Policy Director for the U.S. Water Alliance, and Emily Feenstra, Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers for our first discussion.
Pleasure to be here with my good friend Emily Feenstra from the American Society of Civil Engineers. I know you all have been very busy lately with the quadrennial ASCE infrastructure report card. So do you want to tell us about that process and how that's going for you?
Sure, thanks. Nice to see you, Scott. It's been 2 months since we released our infrastructure report card, and you're right, it comes out once every 4 years, and it seems like the timing of this conversation, especially right and relevant this year with all of the talk around infrastructure. And we've always looked at water categories in the report card, but it's nice to see them getting a lot more attention from policymakers and mayors and governors and the public as well. So in this year's report, the water grades, continue to kind of lag along, but we did see a little bit of progress. We looked at drinking water, and that grade rose to a C minus. And, I'm a mom. I wouldn't love if my kid brought home a C minus, but I have to celebrate progress. And we're seeing some good things in that drinking water sector, including utilities figuring out what it will take to make them more resilient. Figuring out risk assessments and asset management plans, and tripling the rate of the replacement of their water pipes, which are out of sight, out of mind for a lot of Americans.
Right.
Yet at the same time, as we've got continuing public health concerns with emerging contaminants and all these small water systems that desperately need funding and greater partnership from the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and I have both been doing kind of water advocacy for a long time now, and it seems like one of the most exciting times now because people are talking about water as infrastructure and, infrastructure in general, and it's just getting more and more buzz, and people are talking about things like lead service line removal. They're talking about infrastructure and utility modernization. They're talking about these things and making sure that water is part of that message. And I'm struggling to think of a time when water has enjoyed as much kind of like visibility as now, right?
Right, exactly. I think for a long time, us in the infrastructure community, I heard a lot of, well, roads and bridges, you can see them,
Right.
you can see that they're deteriorating, and water pipes nobody is thinking about. But yeah, the conversation about lead line replacement, the conversation about the fact that every American should have clean, safe drinking water, and you know, in addition, we looked at in the report card this year was stormwater. And I think half of our battle
Right.
is just educating people about what stormwater is. You know, but once you kind of explain, you know, people see it anecdotally that there's flooding on city streets that they didn't have before, and rainy day flooding and all the like. And so that debuted at a disappointing D in our 2021 report card, and just reflects the fact that we've got this increased rainfall patterns. You know, the capacity within our drainage and pipe system is kind of being overwhelmed, and there's not really a good system in the US for dealing with stormwater, managing stormwater, even knowing whose problem or responsibility it is. And while it did get a D, we're noticing a good trend of there's 40 states that have created stormwater utilities to try to tackle this problem.
Yeah, so it sounds like that people are paying attention on the public side too, and I don't know, you know, if you all have in your research over the last couple of years putting this together, kind of attributed to the reason that people are paying attention to it. But at least from our end, talking to utilities and community groups and environmental organizations out there, a lot of folks are pointing to the pandemic as really bringing home the idea that how connected we are to water, and how connected we are to water as public health, or water as infrastructure, or water as economic development. A lot of those kinds of ideas have been kicked around over the last year, and I think that's what's potentially leading to a lot more of the attention that water is getting.
Yes, I think you're right. And you know, you kind of started to see that conversation change when there was a tragedy in Flint, but the pandemic's really accelerated it. And you all came out with that poll pretty recently, talking about support for water investment. I think it was higher than ever. Is that right?
So that trend just over the last 6 years from the Value of Water Index has definitely continued to place the public support for water infrastructure investment just tremendously high. It's crazy. Like this year we matched it against things like you know, general infrastructure investment around solving the COVID-19 crisis, around, you know, rebuilding the economy, and it consistently beat all of those things, and just remained high. Although, like, in general, all of those things are high. So I think what what the poll is telling us is that water is top of mind for a lot of people right now, and that they perceive that the state of water infrastructure is impacting their normal and everyday lives in a way that they didn't in years past. You know, where they would look at something like a Flint and say, like, oh, that's something that's not necessarily happening to me. It's happening to other places. But I think people are more invested now in what's happening in their local water systems. And people generally describe the state in the poll of their local water systems as well. But more and more what we're seeing is that nationally, there's growing uncertainty. Like the number of folks that are uncertain about the state of the nation's water infrastructure continues to grow. And I think that that's sort of the message penetrating that water infrastructure really is important to folks, but we're just not sure anymore about what the state of the infrastructure is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also some of the opportunities that come when you do invest in water infrastructure. So there's a little bit of uncertainty, but also maybe some excitement. If we did invest in a substantial transformational way, what we could do with our water infrastructure, and just taking advantage of things that are already out there, but maybe not deployed in every state or community, like technology and water quality sensors and leak detection. And I know ASC, both of our organizations collaborated on that study. It's been a year of studies, but
Right.
last summer, looking at, you know, the benefits of investing in water infrastructure and the investment gap, frankly, that's growing.
Right. And that gap is something like $81 billion in 2019, right? But it's projected to continue to grow. That's something that's reflected in the report cards.
Yes, that's a good question. One of the big, besides the grades that come out, I think one of the big news stories for us was that investment gap. Even though the grades slightly went up when you looked across all the categories, investment gap grew slightly too. And a big portion of that was due to the water infrastructure investment gap. And I think a couple of the reasons that we attributed to that, again, this kind of stagnant federal partner, especially when you look over the past few decades, but also, as utilities get a better sense of their needs when it comes to resilience and climate change, sometimes when you get a better sense of your needs, those needs numbers grow. And taking into account population growth and other factors, we were able to see some growth in those numbers, and looking at new issues or growing issues such as stormwater challenges. So the gap is growing. It's growing pretty significantly, and it has big implications beyond, engineers and construction. It's all of those businesses that rely on water. Manufacturing was one that surprised a lot of people, just how much there are water reliant businesses out there that could be crippled if they don't have good, reliable infrastructure.
Absolutely, and I think that the healthcare was another one of those places where people saw that nowadays. Public health is sort of top of mind for a lot of people, but there were news stories that came around over the last year about one of our best lines of defense against COVID in the early days was people washing their hands, but there were a lot of stories about people that just didn't have access to water, or that because of their water situations couldn't effectively socially distance. And so I think that not only manufacturing, but I think like the water's role in public health and healthcare is also something that is front of mind for a lot of folks now too.
And I know you all have done a lot of work on access and affordability, and kind of how are you tackling that message of, water rates are rising, understandably, as we face the maintenance backlog and utilities try to get to a point where they can make the investments they need to maintain and modernize their systems. But there's households, a growing number, that can't afford those water bills. That's a conversation that's happening, I feel like, on Capitol Hill right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more present in Capitol Hill conversations than it has been in years past, which is heartening, as a multi-year water advocate, that a lot of folks are starting to take some of these bigger, broader water issues more seriously. And you're right, like the access question was something that has consistently come up over the last couple of years, but especially over the last year with the pandemic, and a lot of those stories about people that couldn't connect to water systems. And I think that's another issue about what is and what is not reflected in that sort of growing infrastructure gap, right? Like, I don't know if that gap takes into account things like folks that never had water systems to begin with, right? And so or some of the folks where decentralized water systems are the ones that make the most sense because they're, geographically remote, or, across widespread systems, or their soils or some things just don't lend themselves to centralized water systems. And so like those kinds of things seem to get lost a lot of times in some of these larger conversations around, it'd be great if we had $1 trillion infrastructure package, or $100 billion in the president's package for water infrastructure. And some of that, that's tremendously helpful, but not all of that is aimed at solving some of these other problems in the water sector about people who just continue to not have access, or the folks that don't have access to affordable water. And as water rates continue to rise, I think there's going to be more and more folks that find that their water bills are unaffordable going forward. And I know that's something that I'm not sure there's an easy solution to, right? And that's something that it maybe not reflected in some of the other sort of studies that exist out there.
I think it's an exciting time right now to be talking about infrastructure overall, but just what we can do for communities across the country that are dealing with issues in their drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems, and raising some of those grades in the context of jobs, but also just healthy, safe communities. So we're feeling hopeful that the time has come for some of these improvements and that strong federal leadership, and excited to continue the conversation today.
I love that message of hope, right? Even in the face of grades like D's and C minuses, like we're still tremendously hopeful about the future. I love that. It appears like we're almost out of time. So this has been a great conversation, and I look forward to what's coming next.
Thanks, Scott. Good to talk with you.
All right. Take care, Emily. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am Renee Willett, Vice President of Programs and Strategy for the U.S. Water Alliance, and I'm so happy to be here with incredible leaders during United for Infrastructure Week. This panel is brought to you by the Value of Water campaign, which seeks to educate and inspire the nation on how water is essential, invaluable, and in need of investment. It's an initiative of the U.S. Water Alliance, and it sits on the steering committee for United for Infrastructure. And with all of the exciting news and policy developments we've seen from the Biden-Harris administration, we're so pleased with the momentum and specifically the recognition of water infrastructure in the national conversation. The Value of Water campaign did a recent poll that found Americans vastly support investing in water infrastructure and that more people are aware that there are problems with our water infrastructure across the country. So the purpose of this panel today is really to hear from some of our leaders across the country about what it would mean to communities if we were to actually close the water infrastructure gap. What would the implications be for jobs, the economy, public health? And why should the federal government change course and start to substantially fund water infrastructure after decades of declining federal support? Now I'm excited to introduce our expert panelists that each bring a unique perspective to this conversation. We have Josina Morita, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. Hi, Josina. So happy you're here. Will Pickering, CEO of Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority. Kevin Reilly from LiUNA, and Rick Callender from he is the CEO of the Valley Water in California. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so happy to see you. And first, let's start with Josina. I'd like to ask you a framing question to open it up. Could you tell us one thing in particular it would mean for Chicago if the federal government stepped up and actually started funding water infrastructure in a significant way?
I think, like you said, there's been a major shift from the federal government of not only not investing in infrastructure and now investing in infrastructure, but talking about water, stormwater, wastewater, which is our business at Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. So we hope what this means is that we can really finally address a lot of the gaps in terms of our stormwater infrastructure, particularly in areas that have been disinvested for a very long time. So it's important for us also to put an equity framework on how we go about prioritizing and implementing. But we've done a lot of our phase 1 projects, the deep tunnel, but our phase 2 targeted infrastructure, stormwater projects, and communities that are hit hardest who've lacked investment with an equity framework is going to change the game here in Cook County.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Will, I'm going to ask you more about your lead line replacement program shortly, but I do want to hear what's next for Pittsburgh. What's the next big water challenge you're tackling, and what would significant federal investment mean to you?
Thanks, Renee, and I'll begin by saying it's an honor to be with this group to talk about some positive news coming from the federal government. We're all keeping our fingers crossed that this funding becomes a reality. And for us, my mind immediately jumps to affordability. We have very ambitious plans that we're already moving forward on our drinking water treatment and storage and supply side of things. We're pursuing a WIFIA grant or WIFIA funding rather. It's not a grant, so that is a financing tool that eventually ratepayers will have to pay back. And we're looking at projects that in total are around $300 million, and we see building them in the next 3 to 5 years or so. So if the infrastructure bill becomes a reality, I'm looking for opportunities to offset those costs and free up some of those financing options for other projects. So right now we're relying really solely on our ratepayers to finance very expensive infrastructure projects on the drinking water and stormwater side of things. So my mind immediately goes to, okay, if there's grant funding, that's less we're going to have to ask of our ratepayers. Pittsburgh is a fairly small rate base, so we're tapping about 300,000 people for $1 to $2 billion of work over the next 3 to 5 years. So I think this really could shift the conversation about equity in terms of affordability and making sure that people aren't priced out of the region due to utility costs. So I think there's a lot of promise there in the specific example here in Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Will. Yes, I think it will be interesting to see how the package kind of plays out in terms of loans versus grants. So really appreciate those comments. Kevin, you have a different perspective than the utility leaders on this panel. What would it mean for the labor movement if the federal government invested in water? And what are the stakes for your workers?
Well, we think water infrastructure may be the biggest two-for-one investment opportunity there is for our members, as well as taxpayers, because you have to remember not all construction jobs are good jobs. But with public works, construction, water and sewer systems, with the skills required and the higher labor standards and the prevailing wage requirements, that creates a general contractor demand for union laborers. And that's good for us because LIUNA members do work on all kinds of water projects, from big signature projects like the Blue Plains Tunnel in DC, which I know Will's familiar with, to the rainwater catchment systems on rooftops and everything in between. So those jobs naturally require the commitment of Congress to invest in water infrastructure, and that's a priority for us. But I say it's a two-for-one because our members are, they're reinvesting those dollars right back into the communities where they live. And that's where they work. So when they build water infrastructure, they're not just, they're providing clean access to their friends and neighbors and their own families, but they're also spending those wages right back in the restaurants and hardware stores, right in their own neighborhoods. And right now, that's probably, as working families are trying to get back to a pre-pandemic life, that's probably the best kind of economic investment we can make.
Yep. Thank you, Kevin. I definitely hear you on the multiplier effect with water infrastructure investment. That's a great point. And Rick, Valley Water in California, you all have a different set of water challenges than Pittsburgh or Chicago. What's the number one thing you'd put your federal dollars to?
First, Renee, I want to say, well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with the U.S. Water Alliance, always encouraged by the different panels that you put on. So I'm proud to be part of this one. And the thing that we look at, if we were able to put the U.S., put the dollars, the federal investment dollars to work is, right now, this is really a once in a generation opportunity to address a lot of these challenges that are out here. I'm excited that the federal government is actually looking at investing in water infrastructure, just as everyone's been talking about. But some of the biggest federal investment fundings that we could do in terms of applying these dollars is we're trying to expand the development of recycled water to diversify our portfolio and to build locally sourced drought resilient supply. As you've seen right now, the U.S. Drought Monitor just declared us in a severe drought, and we have large scale projects like our Anderson Reservoir project, which is currently empty, so that we can fix the Anderson Dam. And so those are the kind of things that we'd be applying dollars to, fixing aging dams so that they're safe and operable into the future. Right now, we're looking at additional storage projects like Pacheco project that could capture additional rainfall for emergency use during droughts. Drought is definitely on my mind. We did not get enough rain this past year, and since we have our largest reservoir being empty, federal investments into infrastructure projects is definitely critical and would definitely hopefully push us along.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And we're so happy to have you here. It's great to see you again. Okay, for the next round of questioning, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into substance with you each while we have you here on this panel. Kevin, I want to get back to you with workforce. Can you tell us a little bit more about LIUNA's priorities for the water workforce? What would you hope to see included in a bill as Congress works on legislation this summer?
Sure. Well, the first priority for the water workforce is to grow it. And we all know what that means. Congress has to commit resources to water, sewer, flood mitigation projects. And they should be helping municipalities and utilities invest their own capital projects as well. So that's number one, of course. Second, we're concerned about developing the skilled workers of the future. And so we recognize the truth is you can't underinvest in water infrastructure for a generation and expect suddenly an army of skilled workers to be available for the next generation of desperately needed work, right? So the jobs we create now, that we have to create now, will benefit the water industry for years to come. So it's important we do that right. That said, difficult as it is, LIUNA has a long tradition of ramping up quickly to meet these kind of workforce demands. Our LIUNA training arm has over 70 affiliated training centers across the United States and Canada. And we're just one of the union construction trades collectively who invest $1.5 billion a year, serving about 500,000 construction workers into training. And that's second in scale only to like the United States military. So we are ready and able as soon as there's an investment committed. And third, I think this is important. We really see an historic opportunity to build on the work that a lot of our locals have done for years to create career pathways for men and women in communities that have not had access to union construction careers. And to give you an example, from the water sectors, laborers have worked in many areas with utilities and municipalities to increase the number of city residents working on construction projects. And I'll give you an example from Newark, New Jersey, which is by no means the only example, but it's a good one. The mayor and the city council there worked with the trades and contractors to get the city to establish a specific apprenticeship program and create contract requirements to employ city residents in their lead service line replacement program. Right, so our local there, Local 472, give them a shout out, recruited and trained 24 Newark residents as apprentices, which is about half the total number of those created in that program, and most of whom are still on the job 2 years later, and despite COVID, and on their way to a career as a union laborer. So that's an important kind of role that it can play. And I'm getting back to what I was saying before about the 2-for-1 investment. A lot of these apprentices were quoted in the press, when this program got underway. And I remembered all of them talking about the pride they had, working in their own city. And one of our apprentices, Angel Fuentes, said, I feel amazing because I live in the city of Newark and I got 3 kids and they can finally drink from the water faucet and take baths normally and cook regular food. So if that's not a good goal for public works investment, I don't know what is. As far as Congress goes, what's on Capitol Hill, there's some progress. The Senate has overwhelmingly passed the Drinking Water Wastewater Infrastructure Act, and that's putting about $35 billion over 5 years into state water infrastructure programs. And now the House is working on it. So that's a really good start. Our general president has made LIUNA's support for President Biden's job plan very clear. And we are working hard to make sure that there's a sustained federal, reliable commitment to strong job standards, like prevailing wages on public works, and to assisting utilities and localities who want to invest in jobs and work with prevailing wage, local hiring goals, apprenticeship utilization goals. That's how, as the president says, we'll build back better. That's our top priority.
Thank you, Kevin. And it is just so exciting to see the dialogue that's happening right now around infrastructure. After, I think that there's been a bit of a lack of policy movement in infrastructure for the last few years. So it is very exciting to see all members of Congress trying to engage in this and trying to move the country forward. So thank you for those comments. Rick, I want to get back to you. And you talked a little bit about climate stressors that you're facing and how climate change can present, a unique challenge. And I know fire season is coming up right now out west. And I'm just curious, how you would frame why investing in water infrastructure is especially important in areas that are experiencing extreme water stress or climate stress. And how can we ensure federal investment in water infrastructure is accounting for climate change?
Well, yeah, I did mention the fact that we are experiencing another drought. I'd like to say to folks to say, well, do we know we're in a drought? Well, all the indicators are there right now. Right now, we have the third driest season on record in the state of California. And with that, like I said, we have an empty dam. That's our largest dam that we have 10 dams. We can fit all 9 of our other dams into this. So in terms of investment into drought-related infrastructure is critical. We supply all of Silicon Valley with water supply, and our operations have state, national, international impacts. So the tools that the federal government can employ to encourage communities like ours to look at climate resilient infrastructure, investing more in not only recycled water projects, but investing in projects that actually allow for the capture of water in wet years for emergency use in dry years. So if we're looking at, and then because the thing is that right after drought, what you get is flooding. So we also need to invest in long-term flood protection projects and to address sea level rise adaptation projects. So right now the federal government is investing in our South San Francisco Bay Shoreline project. And that's just an example of one of the projects that we have that are going to be looking at a sea level rise. But we're not the only ones with aging dams and aging infrastructures. It's happening throughout the United States. So with not only with climate change, but I think the federal investment into aging dam projects, into dilapidated dam projects, there's many dams that basically just have the outlet open because they are not able to function. So we've really got to encourage and be able to move the federal government to look at these projects, not just in the sense of looking at from climate change, but looking at what the real need is for the United States.
Thank you so much, Rick. Really, really appreciate your comments. Will, I want to get back to Pittsburgh. And I know your lead line replacement program has been getting just a lot of national attention. And, I've heard great things about how it can serve as a model for other communities that need to tackle their lead issues. Can you tell us a little bit more about that program, and what are your opinions on President Biden's proposal to remove all lead lines in the country? And do you think that your model can be scaled to other communities?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think, a fair characterization of our program is that we didn't let a crisis go to waste here in Pittsburgh. We had a really unfortunate situation where our drinking water treatment just wasn't effective in preventing exposure to lead in tap water at homes that have lead service lines. And not every home in Pittsburgh has a lead service line, but a decent percentage did. And we still have, we estimate, about 8,000 lead service lines still in place. We made some initial stumbles early on, but we gathered the resources, we received the funding and some support from the state legislature to be able to give us clarity in replacing both private and public lead service lines at the same time using our ratepayer dollars. And so over the last 3 years or so, we have replaced over 8,000 lead service lines. And along with that, we've taken a very strategic approach. We knew that this was going to be, again, another once in a generation investment. And we knew that we had a goal to replace all lead service lines because there is no safe level of lead in drinking water. And as long as that infrastructure remains in place, even if your water treatment is meeting standards, it still could present a risk. So we came at it with the goal of replacing all of our lead service lines by 2026, but then became the question, the next question was, well, who has their lead service line replaced first? And we worked closely with our county health department officials to look at census-based tracks of blood lead data. We focused on areas that were more likely to have children under the age of 6, because that's one of the highest risk groups when it comes to exposure and negative public health impacts. And we also did our best to be transparent in what we were doing. So we put up all of our records on a searchable map so customers could find out if we believed that they had a lead service line. And we also employed a group that we call the Lead Help Desk. So we have individuals dedicated to our program that are contacting customers, encouraging them to allow us to come into their home and replace the private lead service line, because it's work that's unique in the sense that we're working out in the street, but we need here in Pittsburgh to get into their basement as well and replace that private section of the lead line if it is there. So there's a lot of direct face-to-face contact with customers, hand-holding to a certain extent. So it's almost, equally a public affairs and public engagement program as it is an infrastructure program as well. And we have had a tremendous amount of success with that approach. It's very costly. So I think one of the lessons learned coming out of our program is trying to find out how we can add multiplier effect. So while we're on a street replacing a lead service line, taking a hard look at the water main that's connected to that service line, oftentimes it's also old and in need of replacement. So our programs now are looking to make one swoop into a neighborhood, replacing the water main, taking a look at the condition of the sewer main, even beneath that, to see if we can line that and give it additional age and service to a community, and then also replacing the service line. And I think another compelling reason to focus on lead service lines in water main replacement as well is that when we're done, we resurface the road. So it actually has an ancillary public transportation benefit as well. So there are a lot, there's a public health benefit. Kevin touched on the job creation and training opportunities that these sort of basic infrastructure projects can present in terms of entry-level jobs. So I think it makes absolute sense for the president to prioritize replacing all lead service lines. And we're happy to serve as a model. We're certainly not perfect in what we are doing, and we're continuing to get better. But I would recommend every community, if this funding becomes available, to seriously prioritize putting it toward lead service line replacement.
That's great. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up for you, Will. Are you seeing the dial move a little bit on community trust and community engagement with this program rollout as it's going with your effort around that?
We have. I think it's a multi-pronged issue. Lead in water, as I mentioned, it's a drinking water treatment issue as well as an infrastructure issue, and we've been full speed ahead in trying to address both. But making the investment on that public engagement side of the program has really been very beneficial. People didn't know who we were a few years ago, other than the negative things they read about us in the newspaper. But if we are knocking on doors, if we are going to existing community meetings, so not just expecting people to come to us, but coming to them in areas and in forums where they gather, we're beginning to develop those relationships. It's going to take time. Anytime there's anything like a lead in water crisis in a community, it certainly will take time to rebuild that trust. But we are seeing that because people are recognizing the investment that we're making and that sort of personal connection that you can make through these infrastructure projects and explaining how it's actually going to benefit them. And in this case, really improve their public health for them and their families.
That's great. Thank you, Will. Well, I want to turn to Josina, and then if we have time, I want to do a quick lightning round of questions because I know our panel is going fast. But Josina, so MWRDs, you're in charge of sewers, stormwater, and waterways. And I know, the public tends to think about drinking water and issues like lead in water, like Will was just talking about. But we saw from the ASCE report card that stormwater and wastewater are actually some of the most neglected systems that we have in our country. So what kind of commitment from the federal government would you need to achieve MWRD's goals? And what sort of partnership or change and approach from the federal government would be meaningful?
We're fortunate we're one of those larger agencies that has had a really great track record with the federal government and the Army Corps. And, we became the first entity that was allowed to get direct funding, instead of going through the Army Corps from the EPA to finish phase 2 of McCook. So we've been very fortunate in that way, but we are a very large entity. And so one of our big concerns, this is always true when you have these big federal packages, is how does it get down to the municipalities that need it? In Cook County, particularly in the south suburbs, we have municipalities that are 5,000 people, 10,000 people. They don't have the capacity to apply for these grants. They're lucky if they have a roads and bridges person, like you kind of talked about, let alone a stormwater or a planner or a grant writer. And so one thing that we've been talking to Senator Duckworth is about how do we make this accessible for the communities that we want to see this money get to and that we want to be able to support. But there is this big capacity gap and technical gap that needs to be addressed. And so, one of the things that we've talked about is how do we have a regional approach? Can regions or, multiple municipalities or townships apply at the same time, and be able to, to work as a package? These are some of the challenges that we've been trying to work with in the language and the implementation, specifically to address some of those challenges if we want to get to the communities that we talk about and really want to have an equitable approach to the communities that need it the most. Should I just bring her up?
Hello. Sure.
Right.
Mine could appear at any moment too. This is the new land.
So that's something that's really important to us as we talk about implementation, right? The money is great, but if it doesn't get to the people who really need it in a way that's accessible, that has the impact that we need, exactly. So that's incredibly important, as we, especially again, as we move from our deep tunnel phase 1, massive reservoir program to a more targeted approach that requires the kind of community partnerships that others have talked about, building that trust, having engagement about what that need looks like, and finding a way to get that money to those communities.
Great. Thank you. I totally hear you. Well, we have like 2 minutes left. I'm just going to I'd love to do a quick lightning round with you all. So on the elevator pitch, to someone, if you meet someone and they still think infrastructure is only roads and bridges, they don't understand how water fits into it. In 20 seconds or less, you're in an elevator. can you make the quick case to someone on the fence about why federal investment in water infrastructure is worth their support? So I'll start with Kevin, and then I'll just call on you guys. Kevin, you start.
I don't even get the reasoning, but from a labor's perspective, from a jobs, economic impact, like a trench and a pipe are all the same no matter what molecules are moving through it. Water, cables, fuel. But that said, a sewer drain in a highway is infrastructure, but not one in a city neighborhood. We're not talking about moving margaritas. This is construction for the public good. So I don't see any difference.
I like it. Not talking about moving margaritas, but that sounds kind of nice right now. Will, 20 seconds on your elevator pitch for why water infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's, I think of the value of water campaign. Imagine a day without water. I explained we wouldn't be in this elevator if you didn't have, water service to this building. Fire prevention, public health, everything ties to the ability of the water and sewer infrastructure in a community. So be crazy not to include us as part of the conversation. And I appreciate everyone elevating water infrastructure to be among transportation and bridges and roads, because we're at that scale. We're as important.
Thank you, Will. Rick, turn to you.
All right, I do it in less than 20 seconds. I'd say it's about jobs. It's about the economy. We cannot afford to have another Flint, Michigan occur anywhere in the United States. And what is more essential that's needed than water?
Thank you, Rick. Josina.
We're the most important agency that nobody knows exists, but we are the first agency that you interact with when you wake up and flush your toilet. And when you turn on your faucet, water is the most essential thing. We've seen crises like Flint, and even though we're right along the Great Lakes and have this great water supply, we have huge water problems. We had a boil notice today on the south side of Chicago because a 100-year-old plant pump stopped operating and was, sitting stagnant for an hour. So day to day, being able to have fresh drinking water to drink on a day-to-day basis, flushing your toilet. These are the most essential things to public health and public safety in our daily lives. And if we don't invest in them, we've seen what happens. And so we have to do it now.
Thank you, Josina. And I'll just add that in my 10 seconds, I don't think an economy can exist without water. I've seen a city survive with potholes. I haven't seen a city survive without water or wastewater services, or with potholes. No offense to my transportation partners. Anyway, I want to thank you all for joining this dialogue. Happy United for Infrastructure Week, and I'm looking forward to continuing the dialogue with you all in the coming months as we work with our congressional leaders and the Biden-Harris administration on our infrastructure package. So thank you all. Talk to you later.
Hello, I'm Radhika Fox, the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for Water at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm thrilled to have a conversation with Ike Irby, who's a policy advisor for the Office of the Vice President, to really commemorate Infrastructure Week and the value of water. So we're just going to get started with our discussion. Ike, thank you so much for making the time to chat with me today. And I have to say that the water sector is just thrilled by the deep commitment of President Biden and Vice President Harris as it relates to water. Why is it such a priority for this administration?
Thanks, Radhika, and it's great to chat with you about this. I think we have to start with what we've seen over the past year in the pandemic and the real importance that COVID-19 demonstrated of the value and the need to have clean water. It is a necessity, and what the pandemic did was elevate so many of the other disparities in our society, and one of them was the access to clean water and the need for families and communities to have that access. And so I think that it was just a real key turning point in understanding the value and the need to invest in this critical infrastructure. As we think about climate change, understanding that the climate crisis is exacerbating water scarcity out west. It is having an impact on our stormwater and drinking water infrastructure. And if we're going to address the climate crisis and build resilient infrastructure, that has to include our water infrastructure. And that's why water infrastructure has been such a key component of the president's American Jobs Plan. Right after the American Jobs Plan was announced, the first trip the vice president took to talk about the American Jobs Plan was to her hometown of Oakland, California, and she went to a drinking water treatment plant to emphasize that water infrastructure is infrastructure, it's critical infrastructure, and it's infrastructure that is in all of our communities. And fixing that infrastructure and building new resilient water infrastructure can create really good paying union jobs in those communities so we can provide clean water, create good jobs, and build more resilient communities. We just recently saw the president also visit a water facility in New Orleans. And so this is a really key priority of the administration in the American Jobs Plan. And it's really great to see water elevated to this level and have an administration that's so committed to ensure that all of our communities can have clean drinking water. But one of the things that we've also seen is that as the president has toured in New Orleans and the vice president in California looking at water infrastructure, and as they toured the country over the past year, also hearing from people's stories about the need for investment in water infrastructure, is that we are really critically underinvesting at the federal level and throughout the rest of the country in our water infrastructure. And so one of the things that is so necessary to talk about is what the actual need is, so that we can make sure that we are meeting that need for communities across the nation. So Radhika, what is that need and how can we meet that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ike. And one thing I have to say, I've been hearing from water utilities, local water agencies, public servants, who have just said what it has meant to them that the president and the vice president has come to tour their facilities to really understand what it takes to make these systems work for everybody. But on your question about the need, so the EPA does periodic needs surveys to really understand the state of both of our drinking water and our wastewater infrastructure. So we really need to invest about $750 billion to get these systems into a state of good repair. And that these investments, of course, generate jobs and economic growth, but they're essential public health protection. I think one thing too that's so important is obviously 750 billion, that's a big number, it's a lot of zeros. But if you think about what's at stake for communities, if we don't make those investments, I was recently talking with some community leaders in McDowell County, West Virginia, who really just don't have centralized water infrastructure. And that's such a pressing issue. We have other communities like Detroit and Flint and Newark and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that have systems that have been working for a long time, but they're aging and they're failing and they need that next generation of reinvestment. So, as we think about how big the need is, it's, I think we have to also remember the very personal experience, the personal connection to these systems for communities all across America. But when you hear how important the need is, how do you think, Ike, that the American Jobs Plan can help communities meet their infrastructure, their water infrastructure needs?
So the American Jobs Plan is proposing to invest $111 billion just in water infrastructure. And a major component of that is an incredibly bold but important investment of $45 billion to replace all the nation's lead service lines. We've heard the stories across the country from Flint to New Jersey to Chicago, all of these communities that are trying to find the resources to replace their lead service lines. And this is an opportunity that the president is putting forward for the federal government to come in and say, enough is enough. We need to replace every lead service line in the country. And that is going to have such a massive impact on families across the nation. We know that lead in our drinking water, there's no safe level for a child to have lead in their water. It impacts both our kids, our seniors, and this is within our ability. It's not a technological issue. It is a commitment to investment issue. And that's why the president has put forward that bold goal of replacing 100% of our lead service lines across America. But that's not the only thing that's in that investment. The other is a massive $56 billion investment in reinvesting in, replacing, renewing the nation's drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure through existing programs that states already know how to use, communities already know how to use, and the EPA is already very good at utilizing. But what we are going to propose to do is just massively increase the amount of investment that is going into them to really get at those critical needs across both our urban areas and our rural areas. And then the last part of it is a $10 billion investment in what we need to do to address specific rural water systems, which some people are on their own well water, some people are on small decentralized systems, and they have particular needs that we need to be able to meet. And then also the research that is necessary for the emerging PFAS crisis to make sure that the federal government is coming in and doing its, taking its leadership role in addressing PFAS. So that's a lot of investment that we're putting forward in the American Jobs Plan, and it's really on EPA to implement it. So Radhika, is EPA ready, and how is EPA going to get this done?
We are ready, Ike. We are ready because this is so important to communities. I think what is really wonderful about how the American Jobs Plan is structured is that in the context of the water program, the water proposal, it's using existing and successful mechanisms. So, the EPA has a long-standing track record of utilizing the state revolving loan funds to deliver infrastructure projects to communities. And of course, as you know, we invest the SRF funds in partnership with states. And so I think states are also ready to go when it comes to this. Also, we just closed our 50th WIFIA loan just last week in Roseville, California. And again, we have a track record with that program and ready to deliver, as well as some of the grant and loan programs like the WIN grant program that supports schools and child care centers and other entities in lead removal projects. So I think we can deliver. And what we also know is not only are we achieving the important goals of public health protection and improving water quality through the American Jobs Plan, but that we also are going to generate a huge amount of economic investment. EPA estimates that for every $1 billion that we put into water infrastructure, we create over 15,000 jobs. And these are union jobs. These are good jobs. These are jobs with career ladders. So it's incredible, I think, what we can achieve through the American Jobs Plan. And I just also want to say it's incredible to see the leadership from the White House on PFAS. This is an issue that it impacts hundreds of communities around the country. And I'm really excited Administrator Regan just announced last week a new PFAS executive council. He's asked me to co-chair that effort. And because we really believe that we have to accelerate action on these contaminants and the impacts that they have on communities. So
that's great news on the PFAS work over at EPA. And one of the other things that we hear Administrator Regan talk about all the time, and similar to the president and the vice president, is that in all of this work, we have to ingrain environmental justice and equity in everything that we're doing. And that is in no more critical of a place than here in the water sector, as we talk about clean drinking water. And so what does it mean in water to invest in equity and environmental justice? And how are we going to get that done?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it has, I think, been a dream come true for communities all across the country to hear the vision coming from the White House on equity and environmental justice. And, Administrator Regan a few weeks ago issued a memo really directing all of us across all of our national program offices within the EPA to consider equity and environmental justice in all that we do. So certainly in the context of water infrastructure investment, what that means for us is we have to make sure that low-income communities of color that are hardest hit by poor quality infrastructure receive these funds. Some of our programs target disadvantaged communities, Alaska Native villages, communities across the rural South, the Colonias, the Central Valley in California, where there's huge drinking water challenges. So we have to target investments accordingly. But what we're also thinking about within EPA is how are we considering equity and environmental justice related to our regulatory rulemaking? So, for example, the lead and copper rule, big important rule in the Office of Water. We are actually rethinking how we're doing engagement around that. We're going to be doing community roundtables in those communities that have high concentrations of the lead challenge. So we're thinking about it really across the board, and really hope that that the EPA can deliver on the Justice 40 commitment that has come out of the White House. It's an exciting moment for us to make sure everyone has clean, safe air, water, land. And actually, that brings me to kind of a question for you, which is, I feel like this is water's moment. There was a significant water infrastructure bill that just passed the Senate last week with strong bipartisan support. There's so much excitement around the country about the American Jobs Plan. What's your thought on how we can get this done and how we can get it done together?
Yeah, that's so important. It's because every family needs clean water. And when a mother goes to turn on her faucet at the sink, she's not thinking about who she voted in the last election when she wants to make sure that there's clean drinking water coming out of that. And so this is really an investment in every family that we're trying to make sure that everybody has clean water. And I think the big thing that we need to do is make sure we tell that story, that an investment in water is not an investment in an ideology or a political party. It's investment in communities, and it's investment in healthy families, and it's an investment in jobs. And if we go and tell that story and make sure that people see that story in action, right? That's why it was so important for the vice president and the president to go to the drinking water facilities, because those are in all of our communities. That's what's serving our communities. And there's people that have jobs in those communities that work at those plants to make sure that their communities have clean water. And so, I think the bill passing the Senate is a good example that this is a bipartisan issue. And it's a great starting point to get us where we want to go with the American Jobs Plan of this really bold and necessary investment in water infrastructure across the nation.
I could not agree with you more, Ike. And so one last question for you. It's my favorite question to ask people. What's your favorite body of water?
So I'm a little biased because I'm a marine scientist. And so the marine world kind of pulls at my heartstrings. And I got to spend some time in Maine, a few years in Maine. And the Gulf of Maine is just one of my favorite places in the absolute entire world. It captures my heart every time I think about it. What about you? Where in the world does water pull your heartstrings?
It is the Pacific Ocean for me. I can walk there in the mornings. It's where I take my kids when we want to have some leisure time. So the Pacific Ocean. Well, thank you again, Ike, so much for taking time for this conversation. And to all of the viewers, happy Infrastructure Week. I hope it's a good one.
Yes, happy Infrastructure Week, and looking forward to all of this water investments down the road.
Thank you to all the panelists and speakers for today's discussions. The Value of Water campaign supporters and our colleagues across our sister infrastructure sectors find ourselves in a unique moment where the issues we've been spending years advocating for and educating about are now enjoying a rare moment in the spotlight. If what you've heard today resonated with you, please make sure to let your elected officials know that we can't afford to wait any longer to invest in the critical infrastructure systems that keep water flowing in and out of our communities. I want to thank all our Value of Water campaign members for their sustained support of this incredibly important effort. If you'd like to learn more about the Value of Water campaign, please visit our website at thevalueofwater.org. And thank you for joining us today.